Let's jump right into this one. I like to start the milling process by joining just one edge of this rough sawn lumber. It gives me a straight edge to reference against the table saw fence. This is a checkered board cutting board, and I want the squares to be 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches. So I'll start out by setting my fence at 1 3/4. This material is 8/4 or 2 inches thick, and you never know what wood will do when you stick a saw blade in it. So that's why the 1 3/4. It gives me a little bit of room for movement. So 1 3/4 by 2 inches thick is what I'm going to be working with. Now this one jointed edge does absolutely nothing for the other three faces of this material. It is still rough sawn with all kinds of high and low spots, which allows the board to rock and to tip. So I'll make several passes across the saw, making a cut, raising the blade, and making another cut. This method not only helps with the possibility of kickback caused by binding, but it also allows a more consistent feed rate, which minimizes burn marks. I'll use the miter saw to break these down even further and get rid of any unwanted sections like this knot. Now it's time to dimension this material. I'll use a lumber crayon to mark on all 4 sides, then I'll joint 2 adjoining faces. The joiner is going to clear off those marks on 2 of the sides as well as let me know when they are done. The other 2 sides will be plain to the thickness that I need. I first have to get that 2-inch thick side caught up with the 1 3/4 inch side. Once that's done, I'll pass each piece through twice, flipping the piece 90 degrees between passes, bringing each piece to 1.5 inches square. Next is glue up 1 of 2. I like to use packing tape on the bars of my clamps. This allows for easy cleanup and keeps my clamps working good and looking like new. When I put the tape on, I leave the sides flared out, which sheds the glue away from the bar and makes removing the tape easier also. You want to add tape only to the area which the material will sit. Putting too much on may get in the way of the clamp sliding closed on the piece. Now it's time to start the first glue up. As you lay these out, you want to start with one color and end with the opposite color. And when dealing with odd length pieces like this, keep one end as straight as possible. It helps keep your waste down. And you can see right here I have one piece that is bowed some. It's either too high on the ends, or if I flip it over, it's too high in the center. I could flip it 90 degrees and use the clamps to close the gap, but I made a couple extra pieces, so I'll just wait and see if I need it or not. Basically, we are laying out a flag pattern. I used Titebond 3 on this board since it's waterproof, and I'm sure this board is going to see some moisture when the owner cleans it if nothing else. Just cover one side with glue and flip. And when applying clamping pressure, I like to start with the center clamp and gradually add the pressure, making sure the panel stays as flat as possible. It saves a ton of work in the long run. I also like to add smaller clamps across each seam, and I'll add a couple of clamps across the top of it as well. This helps prevent that potato chip effect. After about 20 minutes or so, I'll scrape off the glue squeeze out. It's the next day, and I'll remove the clamps and begin the cleanup process. And remember, for every one board that's not flat on one side, all the other boards are going to be out on the back side. So take your time when doing these glue ups. The amount of time you put into it depends upon how much you're going to have to put into it later. See how easy those clamps clean up? Now if you have a drum sander, this process will look a whole lot different, but since I don't, I start with a cheap hand plane, removing the larger spots of glue. It's perfect for this task. I can control the depth of my cut, and I'm not dulling my better and much sharper blades. So if you don't have a drum sander and you're making panels, get yourself a cheap hand plane. It will change your life. Next, I'll sand everything, removing as much of the rest of the glue as possible. Once that's done, then I break out my 5.5 and flatten this panel. And I want this flat. This surface is what's going to be joining in the next glue up, so it needs to be flat on both sides. Next, I'll use a reliable square and line up my track saw with one edge and square up one end. Now you can do this in many ways, like on a table saw using the fence or even using a sled on the table saw. I just decided to use the track saw. Using the combination square, I'll line up for the cut. These cuts will determine the thickness of the board. This board is going to be 1.5 inches thick, so I set my square at 1.5 plus the thickness of my saw curve, which is 5/64. As I make these cuts, I'll flip every other one. As you get closer to the end of your panel, you may have to lay a piece under the outer edge of your track to keep it from tilting if you're using a track saw, depending upon the size of your original panel. And I have to say, using the track saw for this worked out just fine for me. Now everyone that's done any gluing up of panels and stuff, they know how slippery wood gets when you're gluing it up. And you can use salt or other tricks to combat this, or you can use this method. It is a little slower, but it works just fine. I want those corners of this pattern to line up perfectly, and I want this as flat as possible. And you can use clamps to hold these pieces flat to each other, and then apply your parallel clamps and add one piece at a time. Now this don't mean wait a day and then glue another piece and then wait another day. Wait 2 or 3 minutes and then add another piece. They will stick in place after just a couple of minutes under pressure. Or you can do this method. Glue 4 or 5 strips at a time. It's much easier to keep 4 or 5 straight than it is to keep 20 or so lined up. Make small panels and then glue those panels together. It allows you also time to remove that glue squeeze out, and after about 2 or 3 minutes in the clamp, you can remove it and add that panel to the previous one. The main thing is to keep it flat and close all your glue joints. Now it's back to sanding to clean up some, and then slightly trim and clean up those edges on all 4 sides. Now it's time to really clean it up and work out any uneven spots that there might be. So I bought some of this 3M extract Cubitron paper. I bought 120 and 180 grit. And I do have to say, I was impressed. It does cut a lot faster and last a lot longer than any of the other brands that I've used. At the router table, I'm going to use a cove cutting bit to cut a profile all the way around the bottom edge of this board. Now you can make hand size handles in the center of each end. I've done this, but for this board I've decided to cut the handle profile all the way around the board. This does two things for me. One, it allows you to just grab the board and pick it up from any spot. Two, this board is 1.5 inches thick, and the profile gives it a slimmer appearance to this thicker board. And why 1.5 inches thick? It's what the customer wanted. Now my bed is a little bit on the dull side and it left some fuzzies and a few burn marks. I'll take just a minute or two to clean that up. Now for the juice groove. I place a V-bit in my router, not for that profile, but to have that point to line up the router. I'll be using a 1/2 inch round nose bit from Whiteside to make the actual juice groove. I line up the point of this bit with the first seam of the pattern and measure from the edge of my board to the edge of the router plate. Using that measurement, I'll make a jig which will guide the router around the board. Using a 1/2 inch ply, I'll cut 2 strips the width of that measurement that I just took. Using Titebond Thick and Quick, I'll glue and brad nail the first piece down. Then I'll cut my fences for the jig. And I realized I will be needing 2 more strips just like the first one in order to have enough. I'll stand up the first fence, glue, clamp, and nail the second piece, sandwiching the fence between the two. I'll be making 2 of these. This will give me enough to make 2 long and 2 short fences. This glue also sets up pretty quick, so there's no waiting around for the glue to dry. Now to separate these 2 sections. I'll just cut those off at the table saw. At the miter saw, I'll cut 1 long and 1 short fence from each piece. Now since the cutting is done, I'll reinforce the fences with some screws from the bottom side. This is how this is going to work. And I'll have some screw holes to fill with some epoxy or something later in my assembly table, but I'm going to just fasten it straight down to the top of this table. Now with a 1/2 inch round nose bit in the router, I will run the router around the board, keeping the round edge of the router base to the fence. If your base has a flat side on it like mine, you will want to turn the router to keep the round side of the base touching the fence, making a slight pass and then lowering the bit until you reach the desired depth of cut for your groove. Then I'll round over the edge with a round over bit in a trim router, prepping the exit corners to prevent tear out. Now to clean that up, I'll sand the top and the edges and scrape the groove with a card scraper and then vacuum the board off. Now it's time to add some rubber feet to the bottom of this board. I use tape to prevent marking on the board. Using a combination square, I'll mark at the desired location from both sides, and then I'll drill at the X. Now it's time to take those rubber feet back off and let's make this thing shine. I'll be using Rubio Monocoat. There's nothing like bringing your piece to life, and that's exactly what happens when you apply a finish like this. Spread it out and wipe off the excess. Then put the feet back on and do the top. With the juice groove, I just worked the finish down in that with my fingers and then did the same on the edges. Well, that'll do it for this one. Let me know in the comments what you think. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and poke that subscribe button if you haven't already. And until next time, thanks for watching.